So my name's David Rogers, and I started a software company a few years ago called Allogy Interactive. So, sorry, is that better? Yeah. Okay, great, thanks. So I started a software company a few years ago called Allogy Interactive, and a little bit about my background. I was in the Air Force. I was a cadet in the Air Force Academy, and I was getting ready to go on a pilot squad. I was going to be a pilot like my father and grandfather. And what ended up happening was I got a medical discharge around just right after graduation. And so it was a very difficult time for me. I'm thinking, you know, what does the Lord have for me in my life if this is what happened? And so I decided to take some time, a short period of time, and volunteer with an organization that was working in Africa, in Southern Sudan. And I ended up staying there for about 5 years. I met my wife in South Africa, and it just completely changed my life. This was the Lord would call my life to be involved over there. And one of the projects that we worked on was we started a small Christian high school in Southern Sudan. And you know, I was very excited as we were starting to do this. I brought all these books over, and within about 6 months, you know, I was pulling books off the shelf, and there was just bugs eating through all the pages of my books. Some of you might have had similar experiences in the field. And we realized that this wasn't a sustainable way to do things. I mean, just across the board. One of the things that really weighed on my heart was the fact is that we were given the property that was a British school built in the 1950s. And the British came in and built this amazing school. And then during the Civil War, the fighting broke out. All of the buildings were overgrown by jungle. And for 30 years, jungle just encroached over all of these buildings. And it was kind of a surreal experience because you'd be hacking through the brush and you'd be pulling these vines away, and you would find the ruins of an old BP station, like deep in the jungle of Southern Sudan. You think, you know, what is this? You know, and so what struck me is that here I am, you know, 50 years later, trying to start a school, doing the same thing that the British did in a way that didn't work then, and we can't even come close to what they had accomplished. I was just merely patching the old buildings that they had built in the first place. So I started thinking, you know, maybe there's a new way to do education that's going to be more scalable and that's going to be able to reach more people. And so I was able to come out of Sudan. I went and spent some time in seminary, and then I applied for a PhD program at the University of Central Florida in a field called Text and Technologies. That's looking specifically at learning in emerging markets on mobile devices. And one of the things that the Lord worked out providentially is that my advisor, the man who became my mentor, is a guy named Dr. David Metcalf, who's one of the world's leading experts in mobile learning. And he's also a devout Christian. And so when he heard what it was I wanted to do with my research, he gave me a slot in his lab, and he really encouraged me in my research and opened up a lot of opportunities for me. And so as the research started to mature, we formed a company to be able to take on some of these outside projects and also to have some fruitful cross-pollination with projects in industry. Because there's a lot of projects in industry and in the government that are starting to provide some very useful solutions to the same problems that we have in trying to reach people throughout the world. So some of the projects that we've been working on, we've been just fortunate in where we are in some protections we've had to get into some pretty exciting projects. One of the apps that we built for the iPad is called the Federal Register that was cited by the federal CIO as saving the federal government more than $4 million in printing costs for printing of this document that they have every day called the Federal Register. I mean, if you were to stack it up, it comes up to about my waist. And so we turned that into an iPad app. We've developed learning applications for combat medics in the Department of Defense, digital textbooks for McGraw-Hill in the learning field. And in the center down there, you see a learning game that we developed for Mini Cooper, and it's also being used by other automotive companies that uses location-based learning to associate media with specific places so that people who are doing test drives can get media about their cars as they go by different waveforms. So we've been able to do these different projects, and these projects have helped us to understand certain aspects of mobile learning that can help apply to other types of projects. So let me give you an example of one of these discoveries from learning sciences that has tremendous impact in what we can accomplish in mobile learning. So a lot of times when people think about mobile learning or what we're trying to do, we think, man, you know, the best form of education is to be at Cambridge or Oxford or Harvard and be just walking along those, ivory towers and, going into those classrooms and chalk desks and everything. But since we can't do that, let's try to figure out something that's almost as good, and then that's what we can use for the rest of the world. The reality is something very different. The reality is that there are methods, there are discoveries that are being made that show that what we can provide, even in the most rural village of Africa on a mobile device, in some respects can surpass what we have in the very best institutions in traditional learning. One of the things I want to talk about is something called the spacing effect. This is a discovery that has been around for a long time in cognitive psychology, and we're just starting to bring into learning, but it has to do with the way that memories are stored. So the transition from short-term to long-term memory happens according to a biological process where if you review a certain piece of information, and what you're telling your brain to is to remember this for a little bit longer, remember it for a little bit longer. And apparently there is a spacing that if you study things at the right time, you will remember them indefinitely. That's what these curves represent. So if I study something on day one, and I don't look at it again for 30 days, my chance of recall is almost nothing. And think about how do people study for tests in college. And think about it. The night before the test, everybody's hitting the hard, they're cramming, they've got it all locked in short-term memory. They go and they get an A or B on the test, and they don't ever look at it again. 30 days later, they're not going to remember anything that they studied for that test. And that's how our formal education systems work. We spend a lot of time and money learning stuff that we don't remember as soon as we're done. But if you were to take that same amount of time, a study that you spent, and space it out according to intervals, first to 6 days, and at 12 days, and at 36 days, and at 80 days, just little chunks. And what happens is that your mind locks it away in long-term memory. You can remember those things indefinitely. So these types of algorithms are the things that we're able to incorporate into mobile learning resources. That means that smartphone that I can use to deploy a learning program in the most rural village can incorporate mechanisms that are more effective than those being used in traditional classrooms today. Next slide. So let me just step through a few example projects quickly before getting to here's an example of a research project that was funded by the NSF that we did in Haiti just after the big earthquake there. This is an application that we built called Aid Tracker. What Aid Tracker was doing was using a service called Ushahidu. Has anybody here heard of Ushahidu before? So some of you might. Ushahidu was developed by a gentleman named Eric Kirshner, whose parents are Wycliffe missionaries. And he lives in Kenya, and he started this organization. What Ushahidu does is it uses crowd-sourced information, text messages, to report needs that are going on in the community. So what they do is they set up a text message shortcode, and then people use their cell phones to send messages about emergencies or trouble. And so just after the earthquake in Haiti, they set up one of these, and people were sending text messages letting people know where people were trapped in buildings, where there was trouble, where people needed water. And this application was a coordination app that would show those needs as they appear. They'd pop up on a map, and then people would be able to get that information and use it for coordination purposes. We've been developing with some tools next generation digital textbooks that use sometimes they use 3D animation, sometimes use other types of features. They incorporate things like the spacing effect that I talked about. This is one that we've developed in medical marketing. We're also starting to do a lot of healthcare applications. This is an example of an application that's used for helping people schedule appointments and manage their prescriptions and have some sort of social network with their doctors. Their doctors can provide them updates and help coach them through certain. Again, this is another type of app that's used for doctors, a decision support system that gives them an example of how to do a diagnosis for certain types of conditions. And this is an example of systems that are being developed for healthcare provision in emerging markets where people don't have access to fancy technology. They just use SMS. So there's ways to use SMS services, as many people have shared during these meetings, where you can have an interactive service where you can provide people updates, give them codes that can be redeemed for prescriptions. And then when someone shows up in the clinic, one of the big problems with health records in emerging markets is sometimes people are illiterate. So you don't have a way of recognizing whose record goes with which person. And so using biometric recognition sometimes can help you to retrieve those records even if the person can't spell their name, for example, or something like that. And this is an example of an electronic health record tool. And what's interesting about this is that the application that was needed in a lot of parts of the world is that people need the ability to have telemedicine reach back. So, for example, let's say you're treating in the field a trauma case, and it's a very complicated case, and you don't know necessarily what to do. Well, this application is designed such that you could click on that space right up in the top corner, and you could call a specialist who would be on call, and you just use your phone to show them the injury on FaceTime. You just click a button, and now your phone is streaming live the video of what you're looking at. And they can start to advise you and talk you through the procedure. So, these are some of the examples of applications that we've been developing in the healthcare space, so you can start to immediately make connections between the types of tools that people are using in other sectors and the types of tools that we could use for all different sorts of ministry, coaching, and psychology. So one of our clients is Campus Crusade for Christ, and we started working with them in a research capacity years ago with projects in Africa. And one of the things that we were doing was looking at ways to do distributed learning for pastors. And so we partnered with the Nairobi International School of Theology. They were prepared some video curricula, and they started to deploy it on mobile phones. And they had some very interesting findings associated with that. One of the things they found was that that retention and course completion was much better on the mobile platform than it was in the traditional classroom, because travel and infrastructure is so poor in Nairobi, no one could make it to the classes. I mean, so if you're enrolled in a class, it takes you hours on the bus to get there. And so they would have a very hard time seeing people through all the classes. But if they could have a course on a mobile phone, their retention was much higher. And so that's kind of counterintuitive for us, because we would think that retention in a distributed program would be lower. But in many parts of the world where transportation is difficult, it's actually higher. Of course, there was a dramatic reduction in cost. They had a program that they were running at heavy subsidization, which meant that they could only accommodate a handful of students a year. But moving the system to the mobile device, even including the cost of the mobile device, was dramatically less expensive than the classroom instruction, because you have to add in travel, you have to add in accommodation, meals, and so on. Now you have it on a mobile device where the student is still working, they're still with their family, they have no travel costs. So those things can become very, very compelling costs. So this tool right here is an example of what the features are in the back end of the system that we're building for them. It has basically 4 components to it. I'll talk about the publisher one first. What that is it's just a simple tool for being able to format content and make it available on a range of mobile devices. Now, just a caveat, there's lots of people who are working on systems like this, and there's others that might be better for some people than others, and there's some that are open source and there's some that are not. I'm just citing this one as an example so you can see some of the things that are out there. The marketplace feature, one of the ways that we think it's important for people to find content is the same way that we find content on mobile devices today, which is through application marketplaces. And so the feature here is, the idea is that a ministry or a church or an organization should be able to organize their own application marketplace so that people can get into that and they can see what are the apps, what is the content that's recommended by the group that I'm a part of. So workflow and administration, these have to do with tools that are designed to help you to understand how content is being used in your organization. Something that's very important as part of your organization is to, if you're deploying content, you want to know how it's used. You want to set up mechanisms for people to communicate to one another. Maybe, for example, I showed in the earlier slides things about doctor-patient relationships. It might be mentor-discipleship relationships. It might be networks of church planters where you have senior regional church planters who are over other sorts of gentlemen. So organizing these workflows and having metrics that show you how things are being used is very important. So provide all this information as kind of a context to introduce a topic that I think is one of the most important things that is facing us in this issue of mobile learning, and that's the issue of mobile learning as a tool for discipleship. So one of the things that I think is very fascinating about what's happening in the world today is how social networks are bringing about radical transformation all over the world. as a historical note, my father, he had back in the early '80s, started a company building fax machines. And so he loved to talk about fax machines. And one of the things that I'll never forget is during the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were a lot of commentary came out explaining how the fax machine played a pivotal role in the collapse of the Soviet Union, because it was one of the first devices that allowed people to communicate one to many. So what was happening is that people were taking notes, and they were writing subversive notes about the communist regime, and they were doing blast faxes out all over, and it formed kind of an information network, a nascent information network that wasn't under the control of the government. And it was tools like this that began to undermine the control of that totalitarian regime on information. And it's one of the things that contributed to the fall of the Soviet Union. So the humble fax machine, I really think that would be the case, but it was. And what do we have today but tools that are many orders of magnitude more powerful than the fax machine? And they've been creating dramatic circumstances all throughout the world. Here's 3 examples of things that are happening in the world today with social networks. So in the top right corner, that gentleman there, Allogy Interactive, is a blogger in Russia. And he is credited with being the driving force between the largest demonstration that Russia has had in the last 20 years. 50,000 people gathered to protest Putin just over the last couple of days. And his influence through social media is undermining Putin's control of the Russian state. And so that's a kind of a fascinating thing, that through social media he's able to accomplish those sorts of things. Down at the bottom right, of course, you see President Mubarak recently being on trial. Here is a man who was, all-powerful leader of Egypt for a number of years, and there he is in a cage, largely accredited to the power of social media to mobilize people. And then this is a very sad example, but this is what's happening every day in Mexico right now. The drug cartels have such tremendous control over the lives of the people of Mexico that they've begun to turn to social media, things like Twitter, to be able to send out messages and to coordinate and to help protect themselves. And just like in the Soviet Union, just like in Egypt, just like all throughout other places, the drug cartel's control is being undermined by social media and Twitter. And they have tried to intimidate people. They tried to execute people who they think are involved in social media to try to retain that control. But it isn't working. It's not able to accomplish their purpose. And I cite all these examples because social media, the ability to use small, simple, ubiquitous devices to connect people in networks is transforming the world, undermining totalitarian regimes, tearing down strongholds. Now, as Christians, our purpose and our intent is to tear down different kinds of strongholds. We're not so much interested in tearing down physical strongholds. That's not our purpose. But we're interested in tearing down spiritual strongholds. And so I think that there are some lessons that we can learn from the victories of social media that can be applied to the mission of the church. So one of the things that, one other data point that I wanted to share as we get into this is that there are different forms of media, there are different types of relationships that are more or less conducive to what our goals are. Walter Ong was a theorist and a Jesuit priest who did a lot of research on writing and the role of writing in Revelation and how it impacted the mind and consciousness. And one of the things that he wrote that was tremendously fascinating was the idea that writing restructures consciousness. So this is something that even in secular academia, Walter Ong is really held up as a theorist that people study a lot because he looked at how the process of reading, the process of understanding and wrestling with text has a phenomenal impact on the brain and how we think about things. And as I was reading this, in secular classrooms, going through this content, reading through Ong's writings, I kind of think about, why was it that God so deliberately revealed himself through the Word? And why was it that he refused to allow himself to be represented through graven images? And I think that there is an issue here where sometimes spiritual truths, obviously we want to communicate however we can to get our message across. And if that's orality, if that's imagery, then those are wonderful things. But one of the things that I think is very powerful about Christianity and the Bible is that the process of reading opens up to us the ability to think about abstract things in ways that would not otherwise be possible. And so I mention all of this to suggest that when we look at other forms of media and communication, there are some that will be more helpful to communicating the transcendent truths of the Bible, and there are some that will do so in a less perfect way. I hope that that distinction is clear. So when we come to the idea of looking at something like discipleship via mobile technology, what are the distinctives of discipleship as opposed to other forms of social communication? Well, if you look at any social networking tool that's out there today, things like Facebook that are the most common, what are their characteristics? Well, they're peer-to-peer. And if I think about the relationships that I see in the gospel, there certainly are peer-to-peer relationships, but some of the most important relationships are more hierarchical than they are peer-to-peer. They're Christ and his disciples. Okay, they're Paul and Timothy. And so while the peer relationships are important, but what may be more important is a discipleship relationship where you have someone who is young in the faith, who is looking up in his close fellowship with someone who is older in the faith, who is able to speak into their lives and target specific areas where they need growth and really help to nourish them and help them to grow. And so one of the things that we're trying to do to develop this specific concept is look at how social networking technologies can be modified to take advantage of or to really reflect discipleship relationships. So as we canvass the field of all the social networking type of tools, Twitter was one that stood out to us as having a hierarchical relationship. So people follow others, and then you see their Twitter feeds, you see their information. Now, unfortunately, or good or bad, or whatever, the case is that most of what happens on Twitter is fairly trivial. It's silly little announcements that people have, people following celebrities or whatnot. But what we saw on Twitter was the opportunity to have some sort of a hierarchical social network where communication could happen that could be important, that could be substantive and meaningful. And so I want to take that concept and transpose it into another learning theory that I think shows us a way that we can begin to look at the discipleship through mobile technology. So there's a learning theory that's alternatively called the Oxford model, sometimes called classical education, sometimes called humanist education, not in a religious sense, but in an artistic sense. And the idea behind this classical model of education is that you have three pieces. You have curiosity, which is that it's directed by the student. The student is curious and has a heart that longs to learn about things. There is a canon. So there are texts, there are resources that represent the best articulation of an idea, the very best articulation of an important idea to wrestle with. And then there's the community of the disciple and the student and the mentor that helps you to guide you through the canon to answer those deep questions. And so what we came up with was an idea of what if we did something that was like Twitter, but a note that was always tied to a canonical resource that could then be used to share information between a mentor and a disciple. And so you always need a little name. Internally, we need names to understand things. So we called it a pen, which is an old English word that meant an insight or a piece of knowledge, something to know. And so what we're trying to develop is the idea that if books begin to be distributed digitally and other forms of media are distributed digitally, then there ought to be a way to preserve your notes as you're working your way through the text. So, for example, if I'm reading Mere Christianity, let's say I'm in a discipleship group and I'm in college, and I start reading Mere Christianity, and as I'm wrestling through that book, I get to a section of the book that strikes me as something interesting. Well, there should be a way to very simply add a note to that book that says, okay, here's what I'm thinking about this passage. And as I go through those things, those notes are the things that, just like Twitter, we can start to share in social networks between mentors and disciples. And each of those notes becomes points where discussions can happen. And what's really powerful about this is that imagine what happens when we start sharing these things historically. So I have, now that I'm out of college 10 years and I go to lead a small group study, well, I've still got all of my books that I've read from when I was in a Bible study in college, and I've got all of my notes associated for the first, when I first read as a new Christian, Mere Christianity. Well, then I assigned that book to young men that I began to meet and to mentor and disciple, and so as they read the notes that I made when I was in college. And now we can use those as some things that we communicate via in social media. So the concept of this is that we want to focus the relationship on areas that are very important. The ideas that we wrestle with as we're working our way through these resources that represent deep articulation of spiritual ideas. And so this is an example of some early stage research that we're working on about how do we incorporate discipleship into some of the media distribution tools that we're beginning to build. There's many other things that I'd like to share with you if we have time, but hopefully this shows you a direction of some of the ways that we could be going in the future with these digital media strategies. So open for questions. Thanks very much. Sure. So the question was, you use an existing ebook reader platform you can build your notes into? Yes, we're looking at all these different strategies. There's ways to publish the ebook on your own natively according to other formats. There's also ways to, so for example, Amazon has released a thing called Cloud Reader, which is something that we can load into another view, and then you can put notes on top of that, kind of in a layer that floats on top of that. So yes, so that's something that we're looking at, is being able to make those tools ubiquitous so that they can work in lots of different formats. You know, that's a really good observation. And an interesting point to make about that is that the spacing effect was discovered in 1885. So one of the, and it makes the cognitive psychologists mad because they have been sitting on gold for more than 100 years. And that idea has only just recently started to percolate into the learning technology sciences. So you identify an area that really needs improvement because there isn't very good permeability of these ideas to practitioners in a useful way. It's locked up in jargon that's not very helpful to anyone. So that's something that I think needs more transparency.
So this last thing, did you say kind of where that is in progress?
So
the Oxford model, the Ken thing. Did you
say that's a tool that we're building for Crusade right now, and January, about middle of January is when they're going to start using it in a beta project. So we've been doing a series of rollouts. Where they are right now, years ago we started with 40 students. Now they're up to 2,000 students in Africa that they're deploying on. And then this is the next stage of that. So this is going to start in January 15th.
Can you comment briefly on what will that look like to the end user? Like how will that?
So the idea is that the end user is going to have a smartphone, and they're going to have, like I showed you in that previous slide, a hosted marketplace. So in the same way that you would go to the Android marketplace, you would go to the iPhone marketplace, you'll be able to go to a marketplace that's hosted by your ministry. And so when you would go to that place, you'll see the featured books, maybe a list of 10 or 15 resources that are featured. And think of it in the same way as organizing, your own church bookstore. You put the ones up front you want people to see, and then you have the other categories and shelves. So they'll go to that marketplace, they'll see those resources. And I say marketplace in the software context because maybe the things are free. Certainly most of them are going to be free. They pick which titles they want. They download them to their mobile phone, and then it transitions to a library. And the library has those note-taking features in it. It also has other types of assessments in it, things like quizzes, things like flashcards. And so as they work their way through a course that's text and video and some of these interactive elements, there's reports that are being sent back to people who are designated by that workflow process. It might be a local mentor, it might be a regional mentor, it might be in an aggregated way that's that shows all the usage by region. And then what happens is there's a couple other utilities that we're trying to solve problems on right now. Bandwidth is an issue, and the previous speakers were talking about some of those things as well. We're working on ways of using SMS as a modem type of a feature. So for example, we have SMS gateways that we've developed. So if I'm using that course and I take a quiz, it can send the message back without having a data connection as an SMS message. It's parsed and used it that way. So those are some of the things that we're working on right now. What you're commenting on is the idea of platform fragmentation, which I think is an important observation. My response to that, though, is that I think there should be thousands and thousands of app stores. And the reason is because the app store really should be represented to the lowest point of distribution. So if you have an organization that, like for example, there's no reason why each of us shouldn't have our own app store. What I mean by that is that if say Antoine, you're leading a small group at your church, and there's a young man that wants to be discipled, why shouldn't you have your own personal app store where he gets on his mobile device and he sees the books that were transformative in your life? And so we're using the App Store metaphor as a way of managing information and search. So it's not necessarily that it would be competitive or with all of those other strategies. It's just a simpler way of organizing information.
Respect on the hardware, were those smartphones in their hands prior to this, or were they distributed through this?
So the hardware that we used was a phone called Huawei Idios, which was available in Nairobi for $100, 8,000 Kenyan shillings. And the thing about that device, well, the way the hardware worked in the program is that it was included as part of the tuition. So the program actually used microfinance payments, which we could accept over M-Pesa. And so the students made 3 payments of $50. They made $50 payment when they first got the phone, and the content came preloaded. Halfway through the program, they made a second $50 payment over M-Pesa. And then at the conclusion of the program, they made another $50 payment. And so those economic models I was talking about includes the hardware as part of the tuition, and even so, it's still much cheaper than the classroom model. Yes.
So many people are concerned about the face-time aspect of education and discipleship, that being able to look at somebody's eyes and all the things. Is there room for that kind of interaction with the model as well?
Yes, because the way that this particular model is working is that mobile technology is being used to fill the gaps in between those face-to-face sessions. So what's happening is that the students are coming together maybe twice a year or something along those lines. And sometimes that's for the purposes of taking a written assessment and then having time together. Sometimes it's to get the next memory card that they need. Other times it's because one of the use cases that we supported was a pastor who had 12 different congregations. And so what he did was he used the mobile phone so that the pastors, he's only going to see them once every 12 weeks. So they use the mobile phones to study during that time, and then when he comes on that 12th week, he spends all Sunday with them, talking through things and having that face-to-face time. So I think those two pieces work very well together. If it's entirely absent of face-to-face time, then I think you're missing some